We came at this from a number of different angles, and in fact the very original groups of people, the underlying coalition of Publish What You Fund, came from actually very different backgrounds. There were people working on aid effectiveness, like myself. That's my sort of recent background. People that were working on freedom of information, anti-corruption people, governance and integrity people, and a real sense that actually aid transparency is something that could help with all these things. And a sense that it's necessary but not sufficient, and that's quite, in some ways, quite important. It's not going to cause better governance in recipient countries, but it's quite hard to see how it's going to happen without it. It's not going to cause a more efficient use of aid, but again, if you don't know what you're currently doing, it's quite tricky to see how you would do better. So the types of actors that in our work have come out as demanders or potential users of better aid information or more aid information have been, I mean, you know, you can categorise these in different ways, but there seem to be sort of four groups that fall out of this. One is us as taxpayers in northern countries, and actually knowing a little bit more about what's happening, is I actually believe quite fundamental to building support in the constituency around aid. I think some of the concerns that people have about aid and its impact on the development are partly because they don't really have a sense of where it's going and how it's getting there. That's partly comms, yes, and better communications is needed, but it's partly also because it's quite a tricky thing. It's quite a difficult answer. The second group is donors, and particularly to the lens I tend to view these things through as a country level, that it's, if you've got resources that you're trying to program for the next year, figuring out where you're going to put your money, knowing what the government's spending, and knowing what the other donors are spending, whether that's the World Bank, the European Commission, you know, the other 20 or 30 people spending money, you need to know that before you can figure out where to put your own money. It's very hard to make a decision about whether that's a good use of resources until you know where the other resources are, and particularly also where the other resource is going to go. And the third one is CSO, parliamentarians and civil society, incredibly important. It's very hard for them to comment on whether that was a good use of their taxpayers' money until they know what's happening. And recipient governments as well. It's very hard for them to plan where they should put their money, which is still more in most countries than is coming in as aid. One is a set of issues around what needs to be published, which is everything from the policies of why we're choosing to aid certain countries, the flows, the actual money going in, where it's going, particularly also forward flows, because that's so fundamental to everybody being able to plan better. A second set of issues about how that information should be published, which is our second principle. Comparability being the big win in this. If we can actually figure out the collective spend, then we can start to figure out whether it was a good use. And also, going back to the sort of recipient level, people in a district in Rwanda are not particularly, their primary question isn't who's spending the money, it's what's coming in. And they want to know about the whole basket of resources that are being spent in their area. So this ability to collectivise and compare what we're all up to is fundamental. The third principle is that there is a right to information that donors should be acknowledging, and that the fourth, that they should actually be supporting that right. That everybody has that right. If I write an email to, whether it's DFID or USAID, I'm much more likely to get an answer than if somebody writing from a Ugandan or a Sierra Leonean email address. And that's not really acceptable, particularly as Owen was talking about, this framing of the recipient that I think we all have. On our next steps as a campaign and where we're at, we're particularly focusing on the US because they are both the most complicated donor, and partly through that complication, one of the least transparent. The World Bank, again, because they're very large, and because they're very much a scene setter and a tone setter for how the rest of the sector works. the European Union, because again of size, complexity, and the sense that this is very important that those multilateral institutions have a role. And lastly, on this International Aid Transparency Initiative that Judith and Owen mentioned, we see that very much as the locus for developing a standard where we can get these wins from aid transparency. And our real ask from that are around that it reflects the four principles that we've developed to establish what we've done. And we very much welcome the focus and the emphasis and the understanding of this issue within this document, within the Green Paper. And it would be fantastic, since you've arrived, Andrew, I'd love to hear your reflection, how you see perhaps taking that forward, and whether you had a chance to think about your approach to the International Aid Transparency Initiative and how we make sure that a good start, we're all working hard on it, but how we sort of make sure it actually delivers on this really quite significant win for the entire sector. We tend to start things in the development sector, but we don't necessarily always finish. And I think this cannot be one of those, because it will be so game-changing for the sector if we get this right. And we'll start to align some of those accountabilities that we've sometimes lost and that you set out so effectively and clearly in the paper.